English poetry in a crisis? If so, what exactly is the crisis? Or alternatively, in the plural, what are the crises facing the poetry genre of Sri Lankan creative expression? Sri Lankan English Writers Review prompted 3 literary scholars and 2 of them writers to share briefly what each of them saw as the main issues undermining English poetry in Sri Lanka as a field and a literary form. In this compilation, we share with you what Nipuni Ranaweera, Subhagya Liyanage and Vihanga Perera, 3 academics whose work focus on Sri Lankan English literature, had to share with us on this matter.
In Sri Lanka, I think our writing community is very, very small, and it's a given that our poetic community is even smaller and very intimately sort of bound together, I guess, because if you go for one of these literary events, you basically know everybody. It might be a former teacher or a colleague or anybody, and things are very intimate, which is I think a good thing. But I think at the same time it has led to an absence of what you call a healthy critical culture, because I don't know whether this is a new sort of fairly new tendency, but about 10 to 15 years ago you find a lot of sort of criticism happening in more mainstream media such as newspapers. So if a book comes out or if a collection of poetry comes out, you find a lot of people sort of talking about it openly, and sort of if there are points to be criticized, being forthright about these things. But now I think I see a reluctance to like engage with any work at a deeper critical level, which I think is unfortunate and which should not be so. And I think many writers are to sort of gain by being subject to criticism. I think that's very vital if you want to sort of build a healthy network, healthy sort of community of writers and critics and readers. So I think this is something that people need to think about. And so what you get, I think, for the most part is like where reviews are just meant to sort of please and to appreciate a poet or a writer, and sometimes criticisms are taken personally. So I don't think, I think we should sort of transcend that kind of attitude. There are also issues about the range of topics one hears about, from poets, and I'm not saying that it's necessary for a poet to, frantically rush from, one theme to another, and have to be like as diverse as possible. That's not what I mean. But for the most part, I think poets tend to sort of get stuck in a very limited sort of range or domain. And so a poet, for instance, a poet talking about, say, the ethnic conflict, so he or she might produce 1 or 2 or several good or actually unique poems about this theme, and then so over the years you see them sort of you see that they tend to sort of repeat this pattern and get sort of stuck in this kind of and then you encounter the same themes in the same kind of poems. So very, very distinct trait that I see, especially in maybe because I'm a woman, and I see this trait in women poets, and on the other side of the coin we have women readers who also subscribe and who sort of are drawn to this kind of poetry. You see a lot of poets dealing with issues like positive thinking and very this affirmative, very, very what you call feel good kind of poems, where you are supposed to sort of elevate one's sense of well-being, one's confidence, especially if you are a woman, and sort of subscribe to a notion of sisterhood and all that. So all this is perfectly fine. All the sentiments behind these affairs, these issues are very, very, I'm sure, very noble, very, very, very worthwhile. But what is problematic for me is that it's just you wonder whether anything worthwhile can come out of constantly sort of spinning out poetry which deal with very, very vague themes. I mean, very, very and these are not, that's very, very little possibility of anything, innovative coming out of this kind of discourse or this kind of poetry, because these have been sort of dealt with by many poets, over the years, and so you find what is there to offer anew. Because I have met a lot of readers who claim that they are not traditional readers of poetry. They don't go to a poetry shop, a bookshop, and they don't traditionally sort of buy a collection of poetry. But they say that since the visibility of poetry, or like little snippets of poetry on social media and other websites, they have sort of got drawn into the idea of reading poetry. So I don't know whether it's a good tendency which had somehow sort of maybe lost its way, and maybe we can sort of channel that energy into getting people to read and like and appreciate Sri Lankan poetry. So I see a lot of possibilities there, but so the downside is, of course, that you tend to sort of subscribe to kind of a very vague worldview, which is very full of cliches, and I'm not okay with that. But I see a lot of possibilities in using this kind of media.
While Nipuni underlined issues to do with unrefined manuscripts, lack of editing, cliched and repetitive themes, and what she saw as a breakdown in the critical culture in mass media, Subhagya joined the conversation with two significant observations: the impact of social media, which even challenges the very sensibility of poetry, and the question of authenticity in representing local scenes.
Right. So one of the first things that I want to talk about in relation to some of the issues we find in Sri Lankan English poetry writing is that, especially now, you come across these very brief poems, and you find them frequently in the work of Instagram poets mostly. So people like Camille Inkwell, the Typewriter Daily, and so on and so forth. So there's actually a thing called one-line poetry now, and it would sound something like this. You can't grow something that doesn't want to be planted, right? And that's it. So you see what I mean by very brief. And now, because we're looking at Sri Lankan poetry specifically, I have here one such example from a published manuscript, and it's very short. It's about 4 or 5 lines long, and it's titled What. So this is how it goes. What is what? God knows what, no one knows what. And that's it. So I'm sure here the poet is trying to impart some profound wisdom, but the fact of the matter is that it's far too short, because when you write a poem, there's a certain technical, artistic finesse and required, a certain sensibility, and so much more that you need to have in order to write a well-rounded poem. And with something so short, you can't incorporate all that, right? So they're also sometimes they seem rather axiomatic, right? They seem to say something very wise. Sometimes they sound as if they come straight out of a Nicholas Sparks novel. But at the end of the day, they're far too inadequate, right, for them to be classified as poems. And the second point I want to make is that in the Sri Lankan poetry writing setting, there is a certain understanding of what constitutes good poetry. And so your poetry needs to have that socio-political consciousness, relevance. And so it's not enough that you write about your feelings or the sun and the moon. And it is also, I think, what publishers look out for when they read manuscripts. And it's also an accusation leveled against even award-winning poets, right? Sometimes their work is criticized as lacking political thought. And so there is that expectation, right? Understanding that if you're writing poetry, at least some of it needs to be on it needs to engage with socio-political issues. And I'd say that it's not entirely unfair to say that, because poetry writing, it can be revolutionary. So you would expect it to have that kind of socio-political impact. But the truth is that not everyone writes that way, or wants to write that way, or has that political sensibility. And there's nothing wrong with it either. So, but it can be problematic when you have that kind of expectation from poets, because it forces them to be something they're not. And it leads on to now when they write about issues here or issues elsewhere, particularly because if you're writing about the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, you need to be genuinely invested in those issues, right? Because otherwise, unfortunately, you come across as being pretentious because you're writing about something you don't know, you don't want to really talk about, and so on. And from that, I think another thing I want to say is that when you write in English, you're exposed to a certain culture and you're influenced by the movies you watch, the songs you listen to, and the poetry you read, and it shows in your work, quite rightly so. There's nothing wrong with it, but sometimes you can overdo it, right? So, for example, if you're writing about something that happened in a coffee house here in Sri Lanka, you need to make sure it sounds less like Friends and more like an authentic experience that actually happened here in Sri Lanka. And because if you don't do that, once again, it sounds pretentious. You're trying too hard. And I have here actually a poem from the previous manuscript from the manuscript that I read out the earlier poem, and it's titled Music, so maybe this was done deliberately. And the thing is, it contains 3 lines from 3 popular songs, and so maybe the poet actually has some kind of objective in mind, but the fact of the matter is that it sounds, for one thing, it detracts from the originality of the poet's work, right? It's not your work and you're using someone else's work word to word, I must say, and trying to relate it to some other context, to your own feelings, when you could, easily use your own imagination to do it. And sometimes I think this happens quite often, which is why I'm saying it now. And it's the same. I mean, you could actually use a line from a movie and build on it, which is fine, but not use it word to word and have it appear here and there in the poem. Lines from songs or movies, you can't have 80% of that in the poem and 20% of your work, right?
In responding to the crises in Sri Lankan English poetry, Subhagya and Nipuni interacted with the styles, themes, trends, and temperaments that shape our contemporary literary experience. When he joined this conversation, Vihanga spoke of an equally significant area, altogether removed from the writer's workbenches: canon formation, quality control, and the Academy's role in governing poetry.
In addition to what Subha and Nipuni have shared, if I join the conversation, I would feel that the biggest crisis in Sri Lankan English poetry in particular, but also in the larger sense, Sri Lankan English literature produced residentially, locally, is that the academy, the English Academy, has been gradually moving away from making these things their concern over the last 30 years or so. So if you take it from the advent of what we call the age of globalization, we see this, that the bigger concern of the academy has shifted to the globally produced Sri Lankan literature, leaving behind the residential product. So the kind of literature that is produced in the global north by big publishing houses, the kind of literature that helps you to network or connect with the bigger transcontinental, universities, critical scenarios, the kind of literature on behalf of which and for whose justification we have a new theory that is in existence. So I feel the Sri Lankan English Academy has gone there, leaving behind the residential literature into the wilderness. And I think poetry has also suffered, perhaps poetry has suffered greater because of this shift in focus. Now, to put this in context, I would like to briefly draw on how Sri Lankan English writing has developed through the 1970s, 1980s, even to the 1990s, a development in which the English Academy took a very deep interest, and not only that, gave a a certain leadership role and a guidance. So I'm not referring here only to the production of the writing, but it's also, how a critical, let's say, a critical benchmark is maintained, and how discourses are maintained. Some people, look on this as gatekeeping, but that is fine. You need a certain gatekeeper. About the conditions of the gatekeeping, we can have a discussion, we can have a debate, but there has to be a certain, let's say, a quality controlling and a direction given by people who are trained in that field, or people who are experts in that field. And that role was played, I would say, quite diligently and with a great commitment by the English Academy in the formative years of the Sri Lankan English writing discourse. So if I may look for a couple of convenient examples, if you take all the Sri Lankan poets who make the canon, from Patrick Fernando, Lakdas Wickramasinghe, Yasmin Gunaratne, Anne Ranasinghe, Jean Arsanayagam, Richard Isoiza, there are status within the literary sphere. I don't think these are accidents, historical accidents, but these are people who were elevated to that level through a rigorous scholarly exercise in which the academy took the leadership. I think I'll be probably serving short if I don't mention some of the journals which came through the universities, like Ceylon New Writing, New Ceylon Writing. And if you take after the in the late 70s and 1980s, Navasilu. So these journals, which not only showcased poetry, fiction, drama, but also contributed in a central way to critical discourse. I think these were very, even to this time and age, to refer to certain aspects of Sri Lankan writing, these journals actually kind of serve as source material. So if you take today's scenario, there is a big vacuum in the quality control department of things, because since the academy is moving away, these are people who are trained in literature, so they are not too interested in playing a big role in sustaining, promoting, and maintaining the literature. We have other people who doesn't have that same kind of training, but maybe with an interest, right? You can't blame them, but they step in and they set their own standards, which sometimes can be questioned, sometimes can be problematic. But in addition to that, there is an even bigger vacuum in the critical department. So I think when Nipuni spoke, Nipuni touched on this, that we have a scenario, number one, there is very little critical literature coming out of, in the mass media, the field of mass media, very different to what it was even let's say 10, 15 years ago. The critical spaces are fast shrinking. We have a situation where journalists can't write a decent review anymore. And also on top of that, what happens is it's like feel-good criticism where people are very politically correct, politically too conscious. They seem to occupy spaces where what you need is hard-hitting criticism, and a community that accepts criticism as an equally important part of the literary engagement. So what I feel is that the academy has to stage a comeback. The academy has to take a central role in setting the standards, giving direction to Sri Lankan English writing. And by this I mean the residentially produced literature. I think the global literature can take care of itself. There seems to be enough and sundry people taking the writings of the Gunasekaras, the Selvadurais, the Munaveeras seriously. But I think we need people to come and speak about the literature produced here in Sri Lanka. So especially the poetry. So I would say the crisis for me is that the academy has made literature less of its concern, less of its business, and the remedy is for it to come back and hopefully it will contribute to a certain rejuvenation, a necessary rejuvenation, not only in the production but also in the quality control aspect, as well as the literary discourse, including the larger critical organ of literature, coming back to the center.